The following is a presentation of Castle View Baptist Church in Indianapolis, Indiana.
I wonder how many of you have heard the name Joseph Coyle. His friends know him as Joey. A number of years ago, Joey was an underemployed, really unemployed longshoreman on the East Coast. And he was going about his day when he came across, in his neighborhood, 2 yellow containers. Curious as he was to what these containers were doing there, side of the road, he opened them up and he found $1.2 million. Joey was a happy guy. And Joey made some happy people because Joey started to distribute the goods, the spoils, if you will. It turns out what happened was Joey had found unmarked money from a casino that, and this is my favorite part of the story, that had in the news reports fallen off the back of the armored car truck. I want to know what kind of armored car truck this is, and I think they might need to think of a different kind of armored car truck. Like the tailgate popped open, the stuff fell out the back. I mean, how do you miss the 2 large yellow containers with, over $1 million in them? I don't know, but I can pretty much guarantee you what the story did not report. Someone lost their job in that deal. Joey, on the other hand, he's a happy cat. Found the money, started distributing the goods, and making people very happy. Hundreds of dollars of bills are being passed around. New friends are being friendships are being started off, and old ones are being rekindled as he enjoys this. So then what happens with Joey's life is he decides, you know what? Time to take a trip. Couldn't afford it until now. So he desires to go on a trip with a couple of friends to Acapulco. He's going to go have a little vacation. But Joey's a smart guy. He knows that traveling with a large amount of money might be concerning. So he takes envelopes, 21 of them to be exact, and he takes $5,000 and stuffs them into each of the 21 envelopes. And then he takes these long elastic socks and he straps them around with rubber bands around his legs. So he's traveling with $105,000 strapped around his legs as he is about to board the plane at JFK in New York City to fly to vacation with some buddies. Unfortunately, though, Joey gets caught. Before he can get on the plane, he is arrested, captured. The money that he has is obviously confiscated. They find a majority of the rest of the money, but $196,000 was still unaccounted for. Who knows where that is, except for some friends that are now enjoying that perhaps even today. But I was just imagining, though, what it would have been like for Joey to go to court for this, because he was arrested and charged. Now, I don't know if you've thought about this, but it seems odd to me in such a situation, how exceptional this is, right? And we haven't hear about, oh yeah, another armored car left some money behind. Oh yeah, another Joey or Sally or Jimmy picked up some more money that wasn't theirs. And it kind of made me think, how much case law is there out there? Oh yeah, this happened, the state of New York City against Bill Smith back in 52. How many times has this happened? But nevertheless, Joey was charged with theft, which I don't quite honestly understand. His case was, I didn't steal the money. I found the money. In fact, I would imagine Joey's attorney is basically appearing in court and saying, well, Your Honor, so our moms taught us, so it's true. Finders keepers, losers weepers. That's my case, Your Honor. I rest. Well, unfortunately, it doesn't go well for him. Except in some sense it does. He is found not guilty of theft by reason of temporary insanity. I'm just trying to imagine, did anybody really think he had lost his mind? No, that's the imaginative point by which everybody is considered. What if you found $1 million? What would you do with it? Well, apparently, just for a public service announcement, don't go spend it. Turn it in, lest you too get arrested. Well, stories like these are definitely exceptional, not normal. This is, after all, why the story was turned into a book deal, why it was made into a movie that maybe some of you have even seen. Yet, as exceptional as it was, there are still laws in place that help govern us in society for such a situation. As exceptional, as abnormal, and as seeming as unheard of and unfamiliar in your daily experience, nevertheless, there are such laws in place that help us when that day comes when such people have to appear in court. It was like this for the Israelites. The Israelites were made aware of laws that most of them would never have to refer to again by way of their own personal experience. Others they would on a regular basis. But some laws would be common and some would be exceptional. Well, this morning, we will look at some common laws and some exceptional laws, all of which in these laws deal with the subject of stealing. I want to say, by way of reminder, in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 19, in the listing of the 10 Commandments, it says, by English translation of what is really just in Hebrew, 2 Hebrew words, a negative within the imperative, and in the translation it reads, "You shall not steal." You shall not steal. It's important to note in that command that it has no specific object. And the purpose of that lack of object and its specifics is to show that the command transcends any particular set of circumstances or conditions. And so as we've been working our way through the book of Deuteronomy, really seeing what is an elaboration of the 10 Commandments in some form or fashion with principled application, so we find ourselves there this morning. Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 15, through chapter 24, verse 7. And as you can see on the screen behind me, put it back when what you have doesn't belong to you. As we think through this, we need to understand a series of situations that are unfolding. In Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 15 through the end of the chapter, these cases that we're about to read together attempt to draw a line between what is stealing and what is not, by providing guidelines on how to deal with one another's persons or property. Each case appears to be unrelated to the others, except for the common factor of what it concerns in taking what belongs to someone else. And so, just to start us off, look with me, Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 15. "You shall not give up to his master a slave who has escaped from his master to you. He shall dwell with you in your midst in the place that he shall choose within one of your towns. Wherever it suits him, you shall not wrong him. None of the daughters of Israel shall be a cult prostitute, and none of the sons of Israel shall be a cult prostitute. You shall not bring the fee of a prostitute or the wages of a dog into the house of the Lord your God in payment for any vow, for both of these are an abomination to the Lord your God. You shall not charge interest on loans to your brother, interest on money, interest on food, interest on anything that is lent for interest. You may charge a foreigner interest, but you may not charge your brother interest, that the Lord your God may bless you in all that you undertake in the land that you are entering to take possession of it." Verse 21, "If you make a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay in fulfilling it, for the Lord your God will surely require it of you, and you will be guilty of sin. But if you refrain from vowing, you will not be guilty of sin. You shall be careful to do what has passed from your lips, for you have voluntarily vowed to the Lord your God what you have promised with your mouth." Verse 24, "If you go into your neighbor's vineyard, you may eat your fill of grapes, as many as you wish, but you shall not put any in your bag. If you go into your neighbor's standing grain, you may pluck the ears with your hand, but you shall not put a sickle to your neighbor's standing grain." Now, continuing in our text in chapter 24 through verse 7, we transition some. In order to demonstrate the breadth and the scope of the 8th commandment about not stealing, Moses is going to cite various instances of stealing taken from various aspects of life in Israelite society. The first case we're going to see about divorce is dealing with this context of marriage and family. The next two cases in Verses 5 and 6 will deal with the stealing in the context of matters essential for survival. And then verse 7 is an obvious one of kidnapping, which is dealing with the actual theft of a person. So now, read with me chapter 24, verses 1 to 7. When a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes, because he has found some indecency in her, and writes her a certificate of divorce, and puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house, she departs out of his house. And if she goes and becomes another man's wife, and the latter man hates her, and writes her a certificate of divorce, and puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house, or if the latter man dies, who took her to be his wife, then her former husband, who sent her away, may not take her again to be his wife, after she has been defiled, for that is an abomination before the Lord. And you shall not bring sin upon the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance. Verse 5. When a man is newly married, he shall not go out with the army or be liable for any other public duty. He shall be free at home 1 year to be happy with his wife whom he has taken. No one shall take a mill or an upper mill and stone in pledge, for that would be taking a life in pledge. If a man is found stealing one of his brothers of the people of Israel, and if he treats him as a slave or sells him, then that thief shall die. So you shall purge the evil from your midst. And we'll stop there. Okay, so here we are in Deuteronomy chapter 23 in various case laws, if you will, that again, by way of reminder, seem so distant from our current practices and policies today of how we govern ourselves in society, or even how we think about people in our organized manner in society. And yet, as we'll see in the minutes to come, there are still points of application as we see later represented to us again in the New Testament. Let me just first of all kind of give us some bearings here to give some cultural cross-reference of what's going on here in the text, because we need to make sure we understand this. Going back to Deuteronomy chapter 23, you have a situation here where you have other countries who had slaves who in one way or another are getting free from their slave masters and are running into the land that the Israelites would have as a promised land. And God is saying, here's how to treat them. And I need to understand this is countercultural to existing laws that other nations would have had around them, which essentially would have stated, give the slave back to the slave master. Return them. In fact, the translation actually here is not really capturing it well, but it's basically saying to capture them, meaning to hold them yourself in captivity until they can be returned back to their slave master. And yet, what it's saying here, verse 15, you should not give up, meaning you shall not give up to a master a slave who has escaped from his master to you. He shall dwell with you in your midst in the place, here's the key, that he shall choose within one of your towns, wherever it suits him. You shall not wrong him. This was unbelievably rich and exciting with promise to be identified with the people of Israel, because they treated others like others could not find in any other surrounding country around them. What was happening here in the text was that not only is this sort of like an economic policy as to the place and application of slaves and masters, rather, it's a point of compassion and grace that's being fleshed out here in the text. And the key here is that he should not only be allowed to dwell with you, meaning stay with you in your midst, but wherever he chooses, wherever it suits him. This person essentially gets a new identity once they have identified themselves with the people of God, the Israelites. They are no longer to be identified with where they were before. And the reason for this is because the Israelites have what in their own history? Slavery. They were set free from slavery. They were given a new place, a new land, a new people, organized according to the tribes with geographical markers, all a part of this one people group, and they were completely different and free from that. And so insomuch as they understood this from their own testimony, so were they to allow this to be the practice and the place and this abundant grace given to others. Now, you move from that slavery context into verse 17 through 18, dealing with prostitution. You'll notice, if you will, in verses 15 and then 19 and then 24, there are these horizontal laws dealing with man to man And then in verse 17, and then again later on in verse 21, there are these transcendental ones, these vertical relationships to the Lord. So, for example, you have the situation in verses 17 and 18 of prostitution and the house of the Lord your God. If you look at verse 21, again, back to the conversation about the Lord, verse 21, if you make a vow to the Lord your God. So God is concerned that these people live in community, not only according to how they should interact with each other, but also how they interact with God himself in society as his representatives and before him. And so in verse 17, you have this issue of prostitution. Now, the issue here of male prostitution and female prostitution sounds so otherworldly, but it's actually quite common. And tragically, not only was it common in these other nations, but Israel's history, as it goes on to tell the story, is filled with this issue of male prostitutes and female prostitutes. And what's happening here is this expression about the wages of a dog is just a vernacular of male prostitution, that it should not be allowed into the house of the Lord your God in payment for any vow. In other words, there needs to be a separation of how money is earned in its sinful ways from how it's given in supporting the work of the Lord. The Lord considers this an abomination. Then he gets back into interest. Now you notice, it looks to be a double standard in verse 19 and verse 20. You cannot charge interest on loans, but you may charge a foreigner. It's like, wait a minute, did that just reverse 15 and 16? 15 and 16 looks like you're really compassionate towards a foreigner. The reason why is because in verse 19, the issue here is compassion to those who are in need. Here in Castleview, when you are in a situation as a member of the church, as a member of the household of faith, and you are in a difficult situation, depending on how extreme that is and extenuating that is, we want to help you financially. We have a benevolence ministry to care for you financially, and we want to come alongside you and kind of walk you through with good financial coaching and good compassion and counseling and say, what happened? How can we care for you? Because finances can be a life-ravaging problem that even leads some people to wonder if they should still live. It's that much of a problem. Well, what's happening here in the text is that people are in such a difficult circumstance. This idea of interest on money, interest on food, interest on anything lent for anything, that the context here, as is seen in Leviticus and earlier on in Exodus, is that these are people who are fellow Israelites who are in a season of poverty. And God is saying to them, the last thing you do is make their poverty worse by charging them interest. That would be like Castleview saying, hey, we have a benevolence fund. We want to care for you financially. You're having some very difficult times that's isolated and incidental, and it's not the whole life story. We want to help you, but here's some money to help you, but you have to pay us back, and by the way, with interest. We're going to make some money off your hardship. Sounds unbelievable that you would have to have laws like this, but this is how they lived, and this is the temptation still in the heart of man today. Contrast that from verse 20 about charging a foreigner. It's not a lack of compassion. It's that it moves into a different economic principle of an industry of how they were engaging in business. How they were engaging in business. That it was not somebody in a difficult situation. It's somebody who in surrounding nations was doing business with the Israelites, and how you were allowed to engage wisely, responsibly to doing so. Verse 21 deals with this issue of a vow to the Lord your God. I'm reminded of how significant this is, a lot of Ecclesiastes. Turn with me, if you would, to Ecclesiastes. You're saying, boy, where is Ecclesiastes? Go to the Psalms in the middle of your Bible. Turn to the right. After the Psalms, you get to Proverbs. After Proverbs, you get to Ecclesiastes. Solomon, David's son, Ecclesiastes chapter 5, says the following: guard your steps when you go to the house of God. To draw near to listen is better than to offer the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know that they are doing evil. Be not rash with your mouth, nor let your heart be hasty to utter a word before God, for God is in heaven and you are on earth. Therefore let your words be few, for a dream comes with much busyness, and a fool's voice with many words. Here we go, verse 4, Ecclesiastes 5. When you vow a vow to God, do not delay paying it, for he has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you vow. It is better that you should not vow then that you should vow and not pay. Let not your mouth lead you into sin, and do not say before the messenger that it was a mistake. Why should God be angry at your voice and destroy the work of your hands? When dreams increase, the words grow many. There is vanity, but God is the one you must fear. Solomon is elaborating in Ecclesiastes 5 what Moses is referencing here, that even Jesus picks up on later on when he, in the Sermon on the Mount, speaks about giving an oath and letting your yes be yes and your no be a no. And here in the context is the vow to the Lord that we should not delay in fulfilling it, but we should also be careful in making it. Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 22. If you refrain from vowing, you will not be guilty of sin. The problem today is the same problem they would have had back then. A lot of very eager promises of what you're going to do for the Lord, and a lot of very empty responses that followed. In verse 24 talks about generosity, how they treated people in their own community, in your neighbor's vineyard, and how you filled your fill of grapes. So with this context, I want you to see something here. Each of these are actually sort of strung together, tied together in a way to be able to help the people understand how they live in community in a way that's responsible and not a violation of Deuteronomy chapter 5 about stealing. When is it stealing? When is it not? When do you return? When do you not? Is the person who's going through somebody's field in verse 24 stealing? No, unless, end of verse 24, they're starting to take the people's product and put it in their bags. Why would they do that? Because they're going to try to make money off of them. Now you're stealing crops. Now you're taking somebody else's possession for your own economic benefit, not just for your own life-sustaining benefit. The same issue that's happening here repeatedly. What we see also in 24 is similar with divorce, which I'll get into in a second. Let me take all of this and show you that if you take the Old Testament, particularly in Deuteronomy, the law of Moses, I explained this to you 2 weeks ago, the law of Moses, and begin to see, okay, is this just Old Testament not for us today, or do we find any of these things still addressed and taught on in the New Testament under what Galatians calls the law of Christ, under the new covenant? And we do. So, in light of that, let me give you 5 directions for us today based on New Testament affirmation. 5 directions for us today based on New Testament affirmation that we can understand principally from Deuteronomy as specifically then referenced later on in different ways in New Testament. First of all, living for the Lord is done in a variety of ways. Living for the Lord is done in a variety of ways. Do you realize how little we've actually read in Deuteronomy about worship in the temple before the Lord? How much we've actually read seemingly in the details of how they're conducting themselves in society and how they engage in business and how they interact with each other in relationships, how they even treat their own property. Friends, God is interested in the cracks and crevices of your life and my life as a way to demonstrate what should be true of every Christian's life, and that is the lordship of Christ. See, when Jesus comes, he's not asking to be the Lord of your Sunday morning. He's not asking for a shout out to him in prayer before you have a good meal. He's not asking for you to buy a Bible and give it to your child and tell them, if they're interested, it's there. He is actually asking for every part of your life. Jesus repeatedly teaches this, as then Paul and Peter and others illustrate this in their teaching of how they're to continually demonstrate that whether it's in their communication, whether it's in their thoughts, whether it's with their money, whether it's with their desires, all of it is to be to the Lord. And so we find ourselves back in Deuteronomy chapter 23 going, well, cultic prostitution, not concerned about that. But what would be a concern there? How money is earned in a way that then kind of appeases the conscience that you give to the Lord, but you do it in an unethical manner. How we would take advantage of other people for our own good with greediness in verse 19. That's still true today. And so the situation we see that's happening there that we need to recognize principally throughout all of this text, Deuteronomy 23 and 24, is that living for the Lord is done in a variety of ways. Second direction for us today, second direction, compassion transcends people group. Compassion transcends people group. You'll notice that there is an overarching principle of compassion here that works its way from outside the people of Israel to inside the people of Israel to even within your own household. Let me explain. In verses 15 and 16, there's a compassion that transcends even the people of Israel and how they're to treat others that are not like them. How they're to treat them in a way that's indicative of how they realize that they've been treated themselves. Friends, we are in a repeated cultural conversation today in our country specifically and in our world generally, and that is about issues of social justice and regulating right and wrong and distribution of wealth and all these sort of conversations that can go off the tracks very quickly. But what should always interest Christians in those conversations is the eagerness to show compassion, the eagerness to show kindness, the eagerness to show a level of mercy and grace that is not because the person has your skin color, has your particular ethnicity, has your particular economic class, has your particular family background. And it's not just people other than you, it's people who are like you. This is an overarching principle even within the people of God today. Galatians talks in Galatians 6 about bearing each other's burdens. Well, friends, that's what's happened practically in Deuteronomy 23 with this issue of not charging interest. Yes, your money could be invested elsewhere, and you seemingly could make money. You could seemingly make more money by putting in some other investment vehicle than you could by giving it away to the church or specifically giving away to particular people in need. You could do that economically. That would seemingly make more sense on the return on that investment as it's represented on a ledger. But that's not how the people of God think. That's not how we are with our possessions. We care for the needs of others, and we desire to support them in their season. That's the issue going on in chapter 24. Verse 5, when a man is newly married, he shall not go out with the army or be liable for any other public duty. He shall be free at home 1 year and be happy with his wife with whom he has taken. This is a verse we'll speak on here in a few more minutes with more detail, but principally it's the same idea here, that there is compassion being showed upon somebody in light of the season of life that they're in and how they're to be treated accordingly. Third direction for us today, generosity is demonstrable Christianity. Generosity is demonstrable Christianity. What we're seeing here, particularly in verse 24 and 25, is this application, even understood even today. If you go into your neighbor's vineyard, you may eat your fill of grapes, as many as you wish. You shall not put any in your bag. If you go into your neighbor's standing grain, you may pluck the ears with your hand, but you shall not put a sickle to your neighbor's standing grain. Friends, do you realize the opportunity to show generosity is a demonstration of love for other people? Sometimes the generosity is shown just in your time. It's in your willing to make phone calls, willing to take phone calls otherwise, or just an inconvenience. You're willing to have your Sunday afternoon NFL game that you're really looking forward to be interrupted by an extended time of hospitality with another Christian brother or sister. It's that you're willing to take the money that you've been working hard to earn and receive and handle responsibly, but to demonstrate desire to not let that define you and to dictate how you live and what you live for by giving that away repeatedly, supporting the local church, giving it to those in need as expressed and known biblically. Generosity is seen. We see this in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, as Paul is writing to the Corinthians and how they were and how they should be even like the Macedonians, who even out of great poverty were eager to give to the needs of others. Friends, what's it like for you? What is giving like for you? How is generosity known in your life? Generous with your offerings to the Lord? Generous with your time? Generous with your talents? Some people resent the career they have and having that career in light of the community because they don't want to give themselves away in service. The fourth direction for us today, that needs to be understood. Divorce is permissible, but never preferable. Divorce is permissible, but never preferable. Looking at Deuteronomy chapter 24, gets into kind of an odd situation here. A man who's married, whose now wife is not married to him, who gets married again, but now the first husband can't marry her. What's really happening here in the text? It seems confusing. Well, first of all, let me just tell you what's happening here in Deuteronomy chapter 24 is like a classic example of case law. This is no mandate here for divorce. This is no requirement here for divorce. You'll notice, when a man, if then she, then you shall. What's happening here is that Moses is legislating and helping governing what is a continually growing, pervasive problem with the Israelites, and that was the issue of divorce. In fact, later on, by the time Jesus arrives in the scene in Matthew chapter 19, this proof text here of Deuteronomy chapter 24 is used to support all kinds of crazy reasons for divorce. Your wife burned your dinner last night? Divorce her. That's what some of the law interpretation would be. Your wife put on an outfit today that you didn't really care for? Divorce her. As long as you let her free from that divorce by writing her certificate of divorce, she was free and you were free. Matthew 19. Let me ask you to turn there because I want to bring Jesus in on this conversation specifically of divorce because it is so commonly misunderstood or not even heard at all today. Matthew 19. Jesus will weigh in on our conversation in Deuteronomy 24. When Jesus had finished these sayings, he went away from Galilee and entered the region of Judea beyond the Jordan, and large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. Verse 3, and Pharisees came up to him and tested him. How'd they do this? By asking him, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? He's basically trying to bring them in on a debate happening at that time. What are the reasons you can divorce? Two major schools of thought with religious teachers at that time. He answered, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. Okay, now let's stop right here. We're going to go back to verse 7 in a second. Let me tell you what just happened. This is checkmate. This is like, no, he didn't. This is a drop the mic moment here. And let me tell you why, because it might be missed on you. He is basically being asked to testify, to give his opinion on this hotly contested issue at that time about where is he on his interpretation of the different reasons why you can get a divorce. And so he's trying to bring them into this, and he knows what texts they're citing. He knows the proof text was. He's about to address it himself. He knows they're talking about Deuteronomy 24 that got interpreted. You know where he goes? He leapfrogs right over Deuteronomy 24, and you know where he lands? Genesis 2. You know what's happening in Genesis 2? Garden of Eden, creation. You know what has not happened in Genesis 2? The fall. There is no divorce in Genesis 2. You know what there's in Genesis 2? Peace. Sinless relationship. A complete union between a man and a woman that is in perfect fellowship with each other and with God. Jesus says, you want to know where I stand on this issue of divorce? Read Genesis 2. That's what God intended. Then he says in verse 7, they asked him in verse 7, okay, why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away? Quoting the text we just read this morning. He said to them, because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery. What's he saying? He's like, guys, you've completely misunderstood the whole purpose of Deuteronomy 24. The purpose of Deuteronomy 24 was not to command divorce. It was to help regulate an existing practice of people who were already ending their marriages. He knows what they know, which is Malachi says, God hates divorce. Hates divorce. Now listen to me. If you're here today as a divorced person, that does not mean God hates you. But you need to understand something about divorce. Divorce is not in God's original design for a man and a woman. But today, we think of divorce as just an option. And not even a bad option. Might not be a preferable option, but an option. God is like, I never wanted there to be this option. Jesus is saying the only option that should be is that what you commit yourself to, you shall keep until you die. This is why our vows are often traditionally worded the way that they're worded. In sickness and in health. Till death do us part. But in today's modern society, when divorce can be offered for a variety of reasons, and for seemingly any reasons, while we can make fun of them saying, hey, you mean to tell me seriously, people divorce others because they burnt their dinner? That's ridiculous. Oh, careful. Careful. Because the petitions and the appeals being made for divorce today are as equally ridiculous. Jesus instead is saying here, I say to you, verse 9, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery. Paul later on, developing this argument even further, talks under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit in 1 Corinthians about also in the case of abandonment, where essentially a non-Christian spouse has abandoned a Christian spouse. Paul says, for the sake of peace, let them go, that way you would not be responsible for the ending of that marriage. This is one of the ways in which Christians are the most influenced by worldly thinking, not biblical thinking. Because we often have so many more cases by which we think, oh, that just makes sense. You shouldn't be held responsible. What's happening here is sort of this grander point you should understand. Divorce is permissible but never preferable, and it's only permissible under the conditions by which the Scriptures give. Here in Matthew 19, it's under the context of immorality. Also then in 1 Corinthians, under the context of abandonment. Now, I would be remiss if we're on the conversation or the topic of divorce and marriage and I didn't just speak to this briefly as a side note to pastor all of us, both married and those who aspire to be married, how to think about this. First of all, we need to understand good, solid, stable marriages do not just happen. What does happen are weddings. What does not always happen, it follows those weddings, are good, solid marriages. You know why? Because contrary to a lot of opinion, you know what takes more work than planning a wedding ceremony? Living in that marriage after that wedding ceremony. I will often tell couples in the premarital season of preparation, the husband-to-be often kind of defers to the bride-to-be in her planning of the wedding ceremony. I was like, hey, friend, do not fall asleep at the wheel right now. If you think this is all about her, not about you, you have misunderstood. While she's planning for a wedding ceremony, you're planning for a marriage to follow. The challenge here with marriages is they often wake up to the reality this is a lot harder than they realized. What's happening here in Deuteronomy 24 is the reminder that there are responsibilities that should be considered. In fact, in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 25, looking at this intriguing text, if you will, 24, verse 5 rather, when a man is newly married, he shall not go out with the army or be liable for any other public duty. He shall be free at home 1 year to be happy with his wife, whom he has taken. Some of the parents are like, oh, great, I got a bum living on my couch with his new wife. Not her I'm worried about, it's him. Okay, let's put this in the context. First of all, the reason he would not go out to battle is because it was assumed that he might die in battle. And if he died in battle, guess what he would not have the chance to do? Have kids. So they wanted to be able to provide the man an opportunity to have some posterity, to have some children. Notice, if you will, the implication there. Marriage and children are seen to go hand in hand and continually repeated throughout the Scriptures as to how God thinks of them. It is not the only purpose for marriage, but it is one of the purposes for marriage. But it's one of the ones today that a lot of people reduce or remove from marriage. This is a plaguing problem around the world where secularization reigns. I just read an article this past week about Japan and how much they're in desperate attempt to deal with their failing birth rate and how much it's going to create economic ruin for their country. But it's not unique to Japan. It's in Europe and other places around the world. They have a huge issue because of this repeated reign of secularization that says and thinks differently about children. One of the responsibilities and opportunities here is that if he's not in battle, he's not dying. If he's not dying, he's home with his wife. If he's home with his wife, he has the opportunity to have kids. But it's not just that. It's also other public duties. This doesn't mean he sits at home and plays video games. What this means is that other responsibilities he might have in society as a citizen that would grow with his age and with his responsibility would be withheld as he first establishes that relationship. As it says there in verse 5, to be happy with his wife whom he has taken. He should be enjoying that relationship, cultivating that relationship. Sometimes young couples will make the most foolish decisions in their first year of marriage. Like it's a portfolio they're trying to build together. Then they wonder why they're so stressed out. Well, maybe because you made a series of very quick decisions, none of which are in and of themselves bad, but they came so quick and so much that you kind of acted in an unwise manner without any counsel. Here's Scripture giving counsel how to think about establishing good, solid marriages. Another thing I want to share with you about marriage and divorce is, notice, if you will, the community is helping the society of the marriage. In other words, how the marriage interacts. How they're even expected here in verse 5 to think accordingly. Moses even suggesting this 1 year time together. I also want you to understand here in the text of Scripture, as Jesus notes in Matthew 19, by implication, no marriage partner is going to be perfect. The health of your marriage will not be dependent upon the perfection of your spouse. You don't believe me? You can just ask my wife. She will testify why she's still married to me is not because I am perfect, as surprising as that might be to a few of you. The reality here is that in the context of marriage, it is hard work that's not striving for perfection, but rather to work out in the context of relationship with each other how they love each other. Another thing needs to be recognized here in Deuteronomy 24, particularly verses 1 to 4. Divorce never happens without sin. However small it is, however large it is, however long it's grown, divorce never happens without sin. To say anything else is just to be foolish and naive, to not tell the truth. What does that mean? That means, to reverse engineer that, we have to continually be addressing the sin that so easily entangles us in our marriage, or we are potentially paving the road for a future desire for divorce. So the problem is not, have you ever thought about divorcing your spouse? The problem is you have not dealt with what's made you think about why you want to divorce your spouse. That's the issue. How you're thinking that through. And I don't mean to say it's not a problem. You should think of it like it's okay to think that way. That's a violation of what God is saying. But I'm saying it's not the bigger issue to address. The culture of divorce in the West is so commonly offering Christians a temptation to think like the world, not countercultural to the world. So, living for the Lord is done in a variety of ways. Compassion transcends people group. Generosity is demonstrable Christianity. And divorce is permissible, never preferable. As we think about Deuteronomy 23 and the issues of theft, what belongs to us, what does not, how we treat other people, how we interact with them, how we make pledges with them, how we interact in society and treat each other with compassion, these principles, as represented still to us today for the church in the New Testament, are still applicable and should characterize us as Christians, as a community different than the rest of society, that people would think what makes them different. And the ultimate answer is our faith in Christ. He changed everything. Let's pray.
This has been a presentation of Castle View Baptist Church in Indianapolis, Indiana. For more information about our church or our senior pastor, Eric Bancroft, please click on the link below or visit castleview.org.